Hello, dear students. So, today we are going to start the first chapter in economics of class 9th, that is the story of village Palampur. Now, before we start the chapter and before we try and understand the various concepts, let us first concentrate on the word economics. Now, what is economics? Now, economics is a branch of knowledge that is basically concerned with production and consumption and also transfer of resources. So, every country has scarce resources. That is basically why we are studying economics, that is, scarcity of resources. So, because of these resources being scarce, being scanty, and being less in quantity, we are to study about how they are produced, how they're consumed, and how does the transfer of wealth takes place. So you can also say it is a condition of a region or a group with regards to material prosperity. So that is what is economics, and that is what we're going to study in detail in this chapter. With this chapter, you will be able to understand and you'll be able to relate the subject with your day-to-day activity. So economics is not new to our life. It is not a new subject. It has a lot to do with our day-to-day activities. It is a lot to do with production, with consumption, how we're using things, how we're buying things, right from the morning till the night we sleep. So it is economics has to deal with your everyday life, and that is why it becomes all the more interesting. Before we move ahead with the chapter, let me first tell you what is the purpose behind studying the story of a village Palampur. The purpose here is to introduce you with the basic concepts of economics, and through this story I'm going to explain you how these concepts work in the village Palampur. So what is this village Palampur? Where is it? Where is it located? Is it in India or it is in some other country? So let me tell you here, Palampur is a hypothetical village. It is not a real village, it is an imaginary village. What happens in this village? How do people earn their living? What all activities they are involved in? And how are people earning money here is what we are studying. So like I told you, it's a hypothetical, it's an imaginary village. The basic economic activity that is done here, the basic work that is done here to earn money is farming or agriculture. So majority of the people in Palampur, they're engaged in agriculture for their livelihood. Apart from agriculture, there are also other economic activities that have been done, which include small manufacturing. Now, manufacturing here does not mean they have industries established there. By manufacturing, we mean very small scale manufacturing, like manufacturing incense sticks, maybe handicrafts or things like that. It also includes dairy, producing dairy products, like they involve themselves into animal husbandry. They rear animals. They animals they give them milk. Also, there are other small scale activities been done, and some other services that they give to the fellow villagers to earn their living. Now, after having a fair understanding of the village Palampur, let us look at its various features, starting with its demographic. So this village has almost 450 families living in this village, belonging to various different castes. Almost 80 upper class families live here who own the majority of land in this village, and they have big houses, pakka houses made up of brick and cement. One third of the population here include the scheduled caste people and Dalits, and they are confined to one corner of the village. And comparatively, their houses are much smaller than what the people of the higher classes have. The houses are made up of mud and straw, and most of the houses here have electric connections. The tube wells here are been supplied with electricity. Let us move to the infrastructure of village Palampur. Now, Palampur has a good transportation facilities and it has tongas, bullock carts, and also motor vehicles like motorcycles and jeeps plying on its road. It is very well connected to its neighboring villages and towns. For example, Raiganj is an adjoining village which is very well connected with an all-weather roads to Palampur, which is 3 kilometers away. Also, it has good electricity facility. It has electric connections. It has tube wells which are electrified. It has two primary schools and one high school, and also a dispensary to treat the sick people here in Palampur. So this shows it is a fairly big village with good infrastructural facilities available. Talking about the occupation of people in village Palampur, the main activity, the main economic activity that is done here in this village is agriculture or farming. So majority of the people who live here in Palampur are engaged in farming or the agricultural activities. But that is not the only economic activity done here. Apart from agriculture, people here indulge in shopkeeping, in small manufacturing, and giving transportation facilities, etc. Coming back to the concept of economics that says economics is all about production, consumption, and transfer of wealth. The next question that should come to your mind is what is production and how does that happen? And what are the necessary things for production? So, production is the process of conversion of inputs into outputs. Or let's simply say production is all about converting the raw materials into the finished goods. Let's say if you're producing a car, so all that goes into making and producing a car become your inputs, and the car, that is the final good, is the output. So everything that goes into making of the car, like steel, rubber, plastic, paints, etc., etc., all those would be considered as raw materials or your inputs. And then using those raw materials and inputs, the final good, the finished good that is ready becomes your output, which is the car. So that is production, conversion of inputs into outputs. So for this production, what are the prerequisites? What are the needed things for the production process to go on? For that, we will bring in now the new concept which is known as the factors of production. The factors of production are the prerequisites for production, which include land, labor, capital, and enterprise. No production whatsoever can happen without these four factors, including land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So, the first requirement for production is land. Now, land not only here means land, but also includes the other natural resources like water, forests, minerals. Production cannot happen. The basic requirement for production is land and the natural resources that help in production. The second requirement is labor. Now this means the people who will be actually doing the work. So that is the labor. Now labor can be skilled and unskilled depending upon the type of the job. Now, if you want somebody to treat the sick people, the patients who have some disease or some health problem, you need a doctor for that. Now, doctor cannot be unskilled. He needs to have a degree. He needs to have knowledge. He needs to have experience. So here, for producing a service, that is for giving a treatment, here we need skilled people, which is the doctor. But if you want somebody to work on a piece of land and produce crops, for that no degree, no knowledge as such is needed. Of course you need knowledge on how to work on the land, but no degree, diploma as such is needed. So even the unskilled labor can work on a piece of land. Even an unskilled labor can come and fix the nuts and the bolts. Even the unskilled labor can come and get the electrician's work done in the house. So the labor can be skilled and unskilled depending upon the nature and the type of the job. So that is the second requirement, labor. Coming to the third requirement, that is the physical capital. By capital, basically we mean the money, but here we divide the capital into fixed capital and working capital. Now the name only, the fixed capital and the working capital, the name only suggests the meaning of what we mean by them. By fixed capital, we mean buildings, machines, tools, anything that can be used for a longer period of time. That is fixed capital. Like in the picture, you can see the tractor, the laptop, tools. They're not used just for once. They're used for a number of years, for a longer duration of time. So that will come under the fixed capital. Also, the second type of capital is the working capital. So working capital is something that is used up in the process of production. Like all your raw material, the raw material and money in hand will come under the working capital because it is needed in everyday production, and once used it cannot be used again. Raw material once converted into finished good cannot be used again because now it is converted into a completely new thing. So fixed capital, if we have to put that into definition, fixed capital is something that can use for a longer duration of time. For example, buildings, machines, tools, they can be used again and again. They're not just meant for one-time use. Whereas working capital includes that can be used only once, and it's used up in the process of production. So that is the third requirement or the third factor of production, capital. Coming to the last factor, it is the enterprise or the knowledge that is needed to put together land, labor, and physical capital to produce an output. So without enterprise, like in the picture, you can see the idea, a scientist holding the lab tools or whatever. So they're thinking that they have the thinking that they're creating knowledge. They're thinking about ideas. They're bringing in new creations in their mind to as to how to convert the raw material into finished goods. How will they put together land, labor, and capital to bring in something new? So this is a very new concept that you've learned today, that is about factors of production. And factors of production are the prerequisites of production, which include land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Now this slide shows you what I've already explained in the previous slide. This slide also talks about the factors of production. Here I've mentioned what is the gain from each factor of production. So like if you have a piece of land and you've given it to somebody else to work on that land, what you get in return is the rent. Second, labor, the labor gets the wages. If you have a patch of land and you have somebody coming to your land and working as a labor there, what do you give him in return? It's the wages. So wages is what people get for giving their services to the other people. So they work as labor, and what do they get in return? They get the For capital, the remuneration here is the interest. If I invest my money into something, if I invest my capital into something, what I get in return is the interest. And last but not the least, the enterprise, the human capital, gets the profit. So ultimately, if an entrepreneur brings in all the factors of production like land, labor, capital, and he's converting the finished good into he's converting the raw material into finished good and then selling out in the market, what is he ultimately drawing and what is he ultimately seeking for is the profit. So by now we are very clear about the factors of production and what all is needed for production, what are the prerequisites for production. Now let us come back to our village Palampur and let's see how these factors that we've already learned about, how do land, labor, capital and enterprise, how do they come together in Palampur for the production to happen. So the first factor being land, let us look at how the land is fixed in Palampur. So talking about land, here also in Palampur, 75, as we already know, 75% of the people, 75% of the population in Palampur is engaged in agriculture. So they're basically into farming. 75% of them are into farming. But see, the population slowly and gradually it grows, like everywhere it will grow in Palampur also. But the constraint here is land. Even when the population increases, the land under cultivation is fixed. You cannot increase the land. The land will remain the same. If there's one person living in the village, we have the same amount of land. If there are 10 people living in the village, there's the same amount of land. So land is fixed. Okay, the first factor, land, is fixed. Now, as and when the population increases, the land being fixed is a constraint. So how do we keep increasing the production? With the increase in population, we also have to increase the production. So how do we do that? And how are the people of Palampur doing? What are they doing to increase the production on a fixed piece of land in Palampur is what we are going to study now. So coming back to a previous question, how do we grow more on a fixed piece of land? What are the people in Palampur doing to increase the production on a fixed land? So one common idea or the one common way that has been one common method that is used in almost every village is multiple cropping. Now, what do we mean by multiple cropping? The name only suggests the meaning. Multiple means many. So, multiple cropping here means growing more than one crop. So, there's a scientific reason behind this. If you keep on growing the same crop over and over again, it takes away the important nutrients from the soil. So to have the nutrients, important nutrients intact in the soil, you change the crop every time. So you change you produce 3 to 4 different crops in a year so that the nutrition in the soil is intact, or the lost nutrient which is gone with one crop comes back after growing the second crop, because the second crop may want a different nutrient, so the different nutrient is now consumed and the previous one is now regained. That is multiple cropping. So so we divide the year into various seasons like Kharif season and Rabi season. So during the Kharif season, that is basically the rain season, they grow jowar and bajra. So rains are between August, they start from August and go on till July, September. So this is the Kharif region, Kharif season when they are growing jowar and bajra. Between October and December, they are now growing potatoes. And then in the winter season, they're growing wheat. So with the change in the crop, the nutrition in the soil is maintained, and it is not one nutrition being consumed over and over again, which leads to loss of fertility of the soil. So one way of growing more or increasing production on the same patch of land is by observing multiple cropping, that is growing more than one crop. Okay. And this is possible. Also, they've devoted one part of land for sugarcane production. So sugarcane also gives them jaggery, which can jaggery or good, what we call as good. We get from sugarcane, we get good that these people in Palampur, they sell it to the nearby villages. If you remember in the previous slides, we had studied about Raiganj, which is a bigger village close to Palampur, 3 kilometers away from Palampur. Whenever they're producing sugar cane, they have jaggery with them, which can be sold in Raiganj and nearby villages, and they can earn profits out of it. So they are growing more than one crop is what we are understanding from here. एक से ज़्यादा crop produce हो रहे हैं, and that is how the fertility of the soil is also maintained. So this is how they are growing more on the same patch of land. And all this can happen only through a well-developed system of irrigation. So because this village has good system of irrigation and even electricity run tube wells, growing more becomes easy because of well-developed system of irrigation. Another very important way in which the production can be increased on the same patch of land is the use of modern methods of farming. So modern methods of farming includes better fertilizers, better seeds, better pesticides, which which also led to a revolution in production, which is known as the green revolution. Now this concept is again new to us. Green revolution, green it revolutionized the way in which production was done. So in the year in till mid 1960s, 19 till 1960s, the farmers were using, older methods of cultivation. So they were traditional ways of cultivating. But in the late 1960s, the Indian farmers were introduced to hybrid variety of seeds, or what we call as HYV seeds, high yielding variety of seeds. In the late 1960s, the farmers were introduced to HYV seeds. With the use of HYV seeds, the production increased manifold. So what they were producing, what the farmers were producing with the older traditional seeds, after using HYV seeds, their production increased tremendously. So these seeds were called hybrid variety or high yielding variety seeds. They were the seeds were so made that they were supposed to increase the production manifold. So this brought what was known as the green revolution. Production increased many times, but it was not only the HYV seeds that brought in green revolution. Along with HYV seeds, it asked for better irrigation facilities, chemical fertilizers and pesticides. All of them put together led to something known as green revolution. So on the same piece of land, the land remaining the same, on the same piece of land now far more larger quantities of food grains could be now produced as compared to what the seeds were producing earlier. With HYV seeds, of course, they needed plenty of water, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, but they gave the best results, which we were not getting before HYV seeds were not introduced. So this got us to the green revolution. And if I have to actually tell you the numbers, in Palampur, with green revolution, with the use of HYV seeds, the traditional varieties was giving Palampur only 1300 kgs per hectare. But with the use of HYV seeds, with the production of wheat went from 1300 kg per hectare to 3200 kgs per hectare. So we can conclude with HYV seeds and with modern methods of farming, the wheat production increased tremendously, and this brought in the concept of green revolution. So students, this is very important. The concept of green revolution is very, very important. It has revolutionized the way farming was done in India. But now the question should come to your mind, and everybody should think to himself that definitely HYV seeds increased production. But do you think the over usage of pesticides, chemicals, fertilizers, is the land will the land be able to sustain all those chemicals? Because land ultimately is a natural resource, and overuse of anything destroys the natural resource. So with that, we come to the next slide that talks about how will the land sustain. So let's have a look at it. So with the increase in use of heavy chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides, how will the land sustain? Land being a natural resource, we have to be very careful in its use. The overuse of fertilizers and chemicals will only drain the land of its important nutrients. And we need to have a fertile soil if we want to keep increasing the production. So how will the land sustain when there is continuous overuse of these chemicals? With green revolution, the biggest drawback was the disadvantage of green revolution was that there was incessant use of chemicals on the soil, which ultimately led to the deterioration and ultimately led to the soil losing its important nutrients and its fertility. And also green revolution wanted huge amount of water. So when we are continuously using tube wells, the water table goes below the ground. So even the water table goes down, the water is being used, the underground water is being used. That will also be harmful to the ecosystem. So we have to be very careful, very mindful in the use of these chemicals and fertilizers. Of course, they've gotten us green revolution, they've done us well. And the year late 1960s was a huge achievement for us in terms of green revolution. But with that, we also had to pay, and we're still paying a heavy price, because harsh use of chemicals and fertilizers makes the soil lose its fertility. And land, mind you students, land once destroyed is very, very difficult to restore. So we have to be very mindful of how much chemicals are we using, because excess of anything becomes way too bad. Talking about the land distribution between the farmers of Palampur, now the land is not equally distributed among all the farmers, as we already know that around one third out of 450 families are landless. So around 150 families are there who do not own a land at all. Only the remaining 250 odd families have lands with them, and that too the land distribution among them is also not equal. So the rich and the large farmers have a huge chunk or the major land portion with them. The small farmers have small plots with them which measure even less than 2 hectares. So on these small patches of land, they perform farming, and whatever is produced is meant for their self-consumption only. So out of this small piece of land, whatever they produce, they are not left with anything surplus that can be sold in the market. As you can very well see in the picture or in the figure below, you can see land is scattered. There are small patches of land that go to the small farmers, and these huge lands, the big portions of land, are owned by the large farmers, who are able to produce the surplus crops, that some can go to their family for their self consumption, and the remaining can be sold in the market. So that is how we see the land is not equally distributed among the farmers. The large farmers, the rich farmers have large portions of land with them. Some are totally landless, that is one third of the population in Palampur does not own any land. So they work as land laborers on somebody else's farm. And some farmers, the small farmers who own land, their land is not big enough to produce enough production that can be sold in the market. So whatever they're producing for self consumption. So that is how the land distribution is in the village Palampur. After land, the next factor of production is labor. So in the previous slides, we've already studied how much land is there in the village Palampur and how is land distributed among farmers. Now, after studying about land, the next factor of production comes labor. So somebody has to work on the land to produce something, and the people who work on the land is known as the labor. Now, who will provide this labor? So the small farmers that are there in the village, they work on their own fields. They do not hire, as it is, they have small patches of land, so they do not need any extra labor. It is the farmers themselves, with the help of the family members, they work on their own lands, and they, whatever little they're producing, that goes for self consumption. So they do not have anything left to be sold in the market. So whatever small little production that is there, they're using for self consumption. Talking about the medium and the large farmers who own big part of land, they hire these farm laborers. Now farm laborers are the landless people who do not have their own land. They are being hired by the large farmers. So these laborers work on the lands of large farmers, and what do they get in return? They're giving, now they are working on somebody else's land. So what do they get in return? What is their remuneration? They get everyday wages. So wages is their compensation here. So laborers who work on somebody else's land, they get wages in return as the compensation. And so the wages can be in cash or in kind. Cash is the money that they take away. The compensation can also be given in kind other than cash. So in kind means your crops. So if these farmers are working on the big farmers land, so they can get cash or the money for their hard work and for their work. Also, they can, instead of cash, they can also be paid in terms of crops. So they are not getting cash here, they can also be given crops. And sometimes they've been also given meals. So some large farmers can also give them meals for their everyday works. Along with the cash, they can also get meals. Talking about the condition of the farm laborers in the village, so the condition is not very good. They do not live in good conditions in terms of their wages. So they are paid quite less than what the government has fixed for them. So if we go by the April 2011 data, the government had fixed 120 rupees per day as the wages for the farm laborers. But here in Palampur, they're getting as less as 80 rupees per day. So what we can summarize here is the labor does not get the fair pay as what is decided by the government. So the farm laborers are the ones who provide the labor in the village Palampur. Coming to the next factor of production, that is the capital. After land and labor comes the third factor of production, that is the capital. Now, capital is the money that is needed for the production process. So, in this topic, we are studying where do the small farmers get their capital from, and where do the large and the medium farmers get their capital or the money from. So, talking about the small farmers first, small farmers do not have their own savings. They do not have their extra money with them that could be invested in production. So, they often have to take loans from the money lenders or the large farmers. So, when they go to these informal loans, that is, they have to take loans from the money lenders, these money lenders exploit the small farmers. exploit in terms of high rate of interest. So they, when they take loans from the money lenders or the large farmers, they charge them really high rate of interest. And sometimes this puts so much of pressure on the farmers that they go completely into a debt trap, wherein they are not able to repay the money, and also they are not able to pay the principal amount back. So they're often asked to work on the lands of the large farmers free of cost. So that is how they're also exploited for capital that they take. The next is Next is, where do the medium and the large farmers get the capital from? Now they generally have their own savings. The large farmers, they have their own savings from farming. So let's say last year they've had their crops sold in the market at a good price. So they've earned profit out of previous year's farming. So this profit that they earned the last year, they save it for the next year. So that is how they have their savings from their farming, and they keep reinvesting these savings in as capital every year. So they don't have to actually borrow funds from the money lenders. They generally have their own savings. This slide talks about the sale of surplus farm products. Sale of surplus here means whatever is left after self consumption. So it is the extra production that is left after self consumption. So whenever a farmer produces something, he keeps something for his family consumption, and the rest he goes out to sell in the market. So naturally, the small farmers who have a very small patch of land, they produce accordingly. So when they have small pieces of land with them, they produce a smaller quantity, which only goes for the family production. So they are not left with anything extra or surplus to be sold in the market. But definitely the large farmers, they produce in larger quantities because they have large patches of land with them. So they produce in the large quantities. A small portion of it goes to their families for the family consumption, and then they are left with a large amount that can be sold in the market. And this production that is sold in the market, they earn profits out of it, which again, these profits, they go reinvested in the farming for the next year. So that is how they keep it rolling. Every year they produce, they sell in the market. Whatever profit they earn after selling their crops, they reinvest it into the farming for the next year. That is how the cycle goes on for the large farmers. But unfortunately, the smaller farmers, they do not have anything left as surplus to be sold in the markets. Coming on to the last leg of the chapter that talks about the non-farming activities. Till now, whatever we've studied was about farming, but in the very beginning of the chapter, I had told you that this village is not just into farming, although majority of the population here is engaged in agriculture and farming. But apart from farming and agriculture, there are other non-farming activities also being performed in Palampur. So from these non-farming activities, also a certain population in the village Palampur, they are earning their livelihood. And these non-farming activities include dairy, which is very important non-farming activity here. Uh, with dairy, we mean sale of milk and milk related products. So these population have their own cattle. They engage themselves in animal husbandry. So they have their cows, buffaloes, goats being reared in their houses. So they rear animals. They perform animal husbandry, which produce milk. And this milk can be sold in the village or in the nearby villages, and also they produce milk related products like curd, paneer, etc. that can also be sold along with the milk. So that is a part of the dairy activity. The second non-farming activity is the small scale manufacturing. The small scale manufacturing here means production on a very small scale with the use of, very simple technology. So they are not using sophisticated high tech machines, Of course, they're villagers and they're in the rural areas. So they perform manufacturing on a very small scale, using generally taking help from the family labor only. So they are not hiring skilled men from outside. They, with the help of family members and the family labor, they produce either in their own houses or in the fields. Like in the picture, they've given example of cottage industry. So they're engaged in handicraft, pottery, and knitting. Like these ladies are sitting in the fields and doing knitting and making cloth and related items. So these do not require huge investment. It can be done in the houses or in the fields using generally the family labor only. So that is an example of small scale manufacturing. The other two non-farming activities include shopkeeping and transport. So shopkeeping simply means running your own general stores. So these villagers, some of them are engaged in shopkeeping, wherein they open their own stores in the village area, and these stores sell items of everyday use that is being required for an everyday living, like rice, wheat, other pulses, things like pen, paper, cloth, toothpaste, toothbrush. So in the picture you can see that there's this lady who's selling items of everyday use. So villagers, as and when they need things, they go to these shops and they buy things from here. So that is an example of shopkeeping. So it is like general grocery store that has been opened to sell the items for everyday use. Last but not the least, the last non-farming activity and one of the fastest developing area or the sector is the transport. So whenever we think of a village, we think of bullock carts, tongas running. But this village, as we've already studied, is a fairly developing village. So it definitely has tongas and bullock carts, all of that. But apart from tongas and bullock carts, it also has motorized vehicles running that ferry people from one place to another. Not just people, it also takes goods from one place to another. So even the transport in the village Palampur is fairly developed and it is growing at a faster pace. So these were the non-farming activities that happen in Palampur along with farming. So here we come to the end of this chapter. This was the last leg of the chapter, the non-farming activities. So from this chapter, we should now be very clear about what is economics, and this chapter gives you a general idea of how production and consumption can happen in a region, and how does capital or the wealth gets transferred from one person to the other. So this must have given you, the chapter must have given you a fair idea of what is economics. And with the help of village Palampur, we are just able to create and we are able to create a picture in your mind of what economics is all about, what economic activities are all about, and what do people do to earn their living is the gist of the chapter. I hope you all have made the best out of my explanation, and I hope the PPT helps you in a better understanding of the first chapter of economics of class 9, that is the story of village Palampur. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you very much.